What's up, Power Painters? This is Taylor Payton of taypayart.com and powerpainters.org coming to you today with another Power Painters tutorial. So in this tutorial, the question, or rather the suggestion, comes from Plug Turtle. And Plug Turtle wants to know about line weights, shading, and developing an eye for proportion. Now, these are all very straightforward drawing things, so I'm obviously super stoked to talk about them and demonstrate them for you guys. I'll just pretty quickly hop into Photoshop here, but I just want to address a few things. First and foremost, always express the gratitude that you guys watch this channel. All the likes, shares, and subscribes mean the world to me, so it really helps me stay motivated and keep working on this endeavor that is Power Painters. It's been around for like 3.5 years now, but it's just finally starting to like grow, and it's because the love is there. I mean, it wasn't I was so like strung out on freelance before that I didn't have an opportunity, but now that I actually know and I've worked on some things and I know how to manage my time better, I can find time to do these videos and keep working on putting out new courses for you guys as well. So if you're interested in those or acquiring the courses, which are much more in depth, you can check the link in the description box below. Otherwise, let's talk a little bit about line weights, shading, and proportions. So we're gonna like do the magic super duper video cut to Photoshop now. Loop, and we are in Photoshop now, guys. And just to give myself a little reminder, as well as just a visual reference for you guys to remember what we're working on, it is line weight in big, too big font. Let me scale it down real quick. Okay, so the weight of line, as well as I for proportions and shading. So I'm just going to go through these things fairly briskly. We're going to get a good idea of what each of these means and then bring them together for a small little demonstration. Hopefully you can understand the principle by the time we're done with this and then begin to apply that principle in your own stuff. So first let's talk about line weight. Line weight is a really straightforward concept, but it also has a lot of nuances, and I think that's where people get confused. Now, if you're not thinking about your line weight, I highly recommend you start placing some units of consciousness upon it, because then your lines will be more reflective of your consideration. So basically, if I'm going to draw something like, let's say, circle, the hardest thing to draw in the world, all these lines, well, it's basically one line. This one line is pretty dull. It doesn't have a whole lot of variance. It's the same in thickness all the way across the sphere here. Now, if I take my eraser tool and I start to get rid of a little bit of this action, maybe on this side here, and I start to erase and finesse some of the edges of the line, we can get some rather interesting effects. And you now see that while it doesn't have a perfectly complete shape, it still reads as a circle. Your mind will fill in the gap. And these lines are lost and found now. So it's found here, it's lost here, and it's found here. Also, you see it's very thick at the bottom and it thins out near the top. This is what's going to permit us to have more of an idea of depth and form using line weight. The weight of the line basically refers to how thick or thin it is. So you can lose and find your lines. You can have very heavy lines. You could have very kind of airy lines. Line quality and line weight are things that will sort of evolve in your work as you progress, but just to know a little bit more about it, you really just have to place your attention on it and then begin to practice in a few ways. I'm going to alter my brush real quickly here. I'm going to go into shape dynamics and pull the minimum diameter down. And this way you can see at the bottom right here that if it's 100% at the minimum diameter parameter, I'm going to have that very straightforward kind of dead line. And if I pull it down some more, I can get a little more finesse. You see, I can have some variance based on how hard I'm pressing on my tablet. So with that in mind, I can actually start to draw something with different line weights. So if I doodle literally anything and start thinking about the areas where I want it to feel heavier, then I can begin to express myself better with the line weights. And as a rule of thumb, you want it heavier where you want it to feel shadowed or occluded, and you want it lighter where the light is coming from. So if I turn this into a head, because, as artists, we draw 1,000,001 heads, it's really easy. Then I would have more shading under the jaw. I would, let's make it like an elf dude or something. I would have probably heavier lines underneath the nose if my light's coming from here. And for the eyes, I usually draw the sockets first, or at least the top parts of the socket, and I'll get heavier around the upper eyelid. The thickness of the upper eyelid is, I mean, eyes themselves are just a whole nother tutorial, but basically, I'm thinking about how heavy I want these lines to become shapes and sort of flow between a line and a shape as I'm thinking about the weight of them. You can see it gets super thick and super thin in areas, and this is what creates that dynamism, that stuff that makes lines fun to look at. I can do super thin lines around the nose, so it's barely noticeable but still adds form. And I suppose it's a good time to talk about an eye for proportions, especially since we're talking about a head here. So, in terms of proportions, you just have to learn them by heart at first, as well as distinctly, once again, place units of consciousness upon it. It's not going to be something that will come as easy if you're not actually paying attention. So, first and foremost, you just have to consider things from a very succinct perspective. And what I mean by that is that if you create some subdivisions in space, you should be able to approximate where things are going to line up. So in this head, if I take this and put it on its own layer, I'll pull it up here, scale it down a bit until the proportions look about right. You can see that stuff will line up in a certain way. And this guide isn't entirely accurate, especially since I drew it without making it on the head. But essentially, proportions are just the relationship of things in regards to the whole. So if the whole thing is a head, you have to know where the eyes are in relation to the head, where the nose is in relation to the eyes, where the mouth is in relationship to the nose, and all these things sort of balancing each other out in that capacity. You can subdivide things any number of ways, and that'll help you understand the proportions, especially if you have a little bit stronger of a left brain, because then measurements come into play, and that's something that carpenters and architects use a lot, and it's all creative stuff. So you can kind of flow with that. Otherwise, I would highly recommend if you're more of a right-brained individual, you're more free-flowing, creative, and abstract. I would still recommend learning the proportions, like knowing that eyes are about one eye space apart from one another, things like that. And the nose is usually about 2.5 eyes down. And after a while, it does become second nature, so you won't have to consciously tell yourself that every time you're drawing, because I know that can be sort of not fun after a while. It gets to be kind of tedium, and that makes it not fun to draw. But trust me, just go through some Andrew Loomis books, or there's tons of great books on drawing the head, and probably the best place to learn proportions to me is on the human body because it is difficult enough to study for a while, and if you start to recognize where things are lining up, you will in fact have more of a artistic eye for proportions because the benchmarks like the joints and all that good stuff will eventually help you to measure things on almost any given object once you start with human beings just because of the degree of complexity. It's just a good starting point to do a lot of figure drawing, a lot of gesture drawing. This will help you develop your eye for proportions. But like I said, there's also the plumb lines and measuring stuff too. So a lot of it is going to be just doing it in mass, which means filling pages and pages with gestures and such. That will really help with your proportions. But also don't forget about your plumb lines and being able to line stuff up based on grids because grids are the most accurate format. Although you risk getting a little bit stale, you'll work out of that eventually, so don't worry too much about it. And that's how I would develop an eye for proportions if I were starting over today. because my proportions were pretty wonky for the first couple years, and it's just something you got to work your way out of. And once again, place your consciousness upon it. Don't let it go. Just ask, how are these eyes relating? How is this nose relating? How's all this good stuff going to come together? Because eventually, just step by step, things will start to make more sense to you visually. It just comes with time and also a little bit of study. You cannot forget the study without actually going in and um, creating things based off of books and things that other artists have already established and laid out for us, then it can get to be really hard trying to reinvent that wheel. So do yourself a favor and just pick up a couple books on drawing the figure, drawing the head, or Google for some PDFs or something, because it will pay off. You will get to the point where you're able to just sketch from imagination and still have fairly believable, if not a little stylized, results. And don't be too hard on yourself in the beginning, or at all, really. Don't be undisciplined. Develop discipline, but don't take it to the point where you start to like get way too stressed about it, because it's not that serious. If you make a gross drawing, or if it doesn't come out the way you want it to, and it looks kind of wonky or nasty, or insert negative pejorative term here, then it just means you got to try again, and you got to make a new mistake. Don't make the same mistakes, make new mistakes. That's a good way of thinking about it. Just make mistakes that are going to guide you to the next level. Don't keep making the same ones. Totally just noodling on this head right now. Super stylized, semi-anime face. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about shading, because I'm totally just clicking into drawing mode right now instead of actually trying to explain what I'm doing. Okay, so shading. Let's make this guy bald so shading can be a little bit easier. And we'll just go in and rough in some lost and found lines on his head, like we did with the other head, and give him some eyebrows. He can look a little bit, let's make him a little bit like dubious. Like, what's going on? What's happening? I'm going to sketch in the features real quick, and then I'll shade this just to give you a quick example of how I like to think about shading, or at least one way to think about it, because there are numerous ways of shading. I'll just give you a very simple, succinct way to start shading. So if our light source is up here, we have to know our light source to shade. There's no way we're going to get into some shading without having a light source, because then we're going to shade things incorrectly or inaccurately. It's going to destroy our illusion of having a real or believable lighting scenario. So if the light is coming from this direction, I'm thinking of it in terms of, okay, so the brow ridge I know is going to protrude over the over the eye. There's going to be some light that doesn't get in to the actual eye itself, and I'm just following the light source I've put up for myself, and I'm just making marks that are slightly darker than the base tone, which is white. So in shading, usually you want to go dark first, and let's just say this ear is probably not receiving very much light. A great way to start shading is to mark off areas. So for example, if I go in with some very light lines and configure which planes I actually want to shade, then it'll become a much simpler process. We're just breaking this down into steps. Then the bottom of the lip is going to have some shadow. So essentially, after breaking up the aspects that are not going to be in light, I would just go in and fill those in. And you can do this with sort of a hatching technique like I'm doing here. There's just a bunch of lines in the areas that I know light will not be reaching as easily. I just marked these off. And there's probably going to be some parts in the ear that aren't going to get much light. And then under the head itself, because that's going to be blocked by the jawline and stuff. So there are two kinds of things you want to consider while you're shading. Those are cast shadows as well as form shadows. Cast shadows are if you have, say, an object and that object is being hit with light. There's going to be an aspect of it that is going to block light from reaching things. It's going to be casting a shadow based on where that object is. And so we would fill that shadow area in. That's a cast shadow. So this is a cast shadow right here. Form shadow would be like, okay, so if the light's hitting this front part, I can use my lost and found lines to sort of infer that the shape and the space is being broken up here. And I would shade this part because this is the form shadow. So this is a form shadow because it's a shadow on the object itself. The cast shadow is being created by the object. Form shadows are on the object. So this is a form shadow. And a cast shadow is going to be the shadow coming down from the neck. It's still part of the form, but things like the nose would be blocking light from hitting this area. So you just have to think about what things are going to be blocking light or what part of the form is turning away from the light, giving you shadow. And typically we can get into values and all that stuff, but it's going to get even longer if I talk about more artistic fundamentals, even though I can go on about those all day. Just remember in terms of line weight that you want to vary your line. You don't want to have dead, straightforward looking lines for the most part unless you're going for that style. I mean, for this I could definitely pull it more stylized since it's already heading in that direction, and I could run the contour with some pretty thick lines just because that might lend itself to where it was heading stylistically. And this is all just based on choices you want to make while you're working, and it could, work out in my favor based on that. A great artist to look at for line weight is, and I may not say the name right, even though he's one of my absolute heroes, I should really know this, is Alphonse Mucha. So look him up for line weight. He had a lot of good Art Nouveau stuff that did not have too many different lost and found lines, but usually it was more about strong, distinct separations of shape using line as a graphic element. Eye for proportions, once again, just go and make some grids. You can draw grids over real faces and then take notes on where things are landing. Like an eye is 1 eye distance apart, or the nose is 2.5 down from the eyes, or however you want to dice it. And then there's also shading, which it's basically just filling in shapes based on how bright or dark they are in relation to the light source, thinking about cast shadows and form shadows. So Plug Turtle, I hope that was helpful. To all of you beautiful, beautiful power painters watching the channel, I want to thank you for all your support. If some of these concepts you want elaboration upon them, I would highly recommend checking out some of the beginner drawing course videos on this channel, as well as thinking about acquiring the beginner drawing course on the Power Painters Gumroad page, which the link is in the description box. Other than that, I just want to say happy drawing, happy creating, weight those lines, develop your eye for proportions, and learn shading based on some of the things I have put forward here. Practice, 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 and I will see you in the next video. Take care, Power Painter.